Hey everyone, today I'm going to do a quick overview of secretive marsh bird monitoring. Secretive marsh bird is just a general term referring to those birds that live in marshes. Now they're usually nestled down in the vegetation, they're difficult to access, you really don't see them that often, but they're much easier to hear when they're calling during the breeding season. So we use this protocol, which is kind of a modified avian point count survey, in order to detect the birds, to know that they're there, and hopefully gather data that could be used to estimate their abundance or their density in that habitat. So when I've done secretive marsh bird surveys, I've been following this national protocol so that everything is standardized with how people in other states and other areas have collected data. In my case, I was conducting surveys in Georgia, so we were surveying in the spring from about the beginning of April to mid-May, when the birds would be in breeding condition, when they would be most territorial, and therefore they would be vocalizing the most. And so I had a number of different survey sites. I would head out before dawn and get surveys started about 30 minutes before dawn, and then wrap up within about 2 hours after dawn, since that's the most vocal, most active time of day for these birds. At each survey location, I'd spend 10 minutes conducting an individual survey point count. So that included 5 minutes of me just being quiet and passively listening to the birds as they're calling and going about their business. And then there were 5 minutes where I used a speaker to play pre-recorded calls of these focal bird species and listen to see if the real birds would answer back. So 10 minutes total. And so during that 10-minute survey time, I'm just listening for the birds, estimating, where the bird is relative to, I'm looking out at the marsh. What do I see? I think this bird's over there. Estimate the distance, how far away the bird was, and then record that on the data sheet. Here's an example of the data sheet, just to give you an idea of how this is. So you might have seen some other bird point count data sheets that use like the concentric rings of circles, and you're estimating or like kind of drawing, here's where each individual bird is on there. This kind of works in a similar way. It's just organized like not quite so visually with like the circles. Instead, each individual bird gets its own line in the data sheet, and then you're recording each minute of the survey that individual bird is vocalizing. What kind of vocalization is it making? How far away is it? So these kinds of surveys can be really useful for documenting the presence of these rare or secretive birds, and especially as we're facing more problems with sea level rise, climate change, habitat loss, or impacts to wetlands due to human development, being able to get baseline documentation of these species and their abundance or density across the landscape really gives you a baseline, and then you can compare as more of these changes continue to happen and impact these wild bird populations. An example from my work in Georgia was my Secretive Marsh Bird project that was comparing the bird community composition between natural and altered marshes. So in this diagram, you can see how natural marshes that didn't have any kind of anthropogenic impacts on them, the stream channel meanders, it's much more resilient to flooding, and there's a lot more microhabitat diversity there, compared to altered marshes, which had historically been ditched for mosquito control, or maybe the flow of water had been interrupted by constructing a road in the past. These altered marshes seem to have a lot less microhabitat diversity, and they're certainly not as good for flood protection, not quite as resilient during hurricanes and things like that. The most common birds that I detected were clapper rails, and I'll add a little audio clip of their calls right here. The second most common birds were marsh wrens. and the third most common birds were sedge wrens. So really interestingly, I found that clapper rails and marsh wrens were more common in the natural marshes, whereas the sedge wrens were more common in the altered marshes. So the difference there could be due to the fact that sedge wrens use slightly different habitats than the other two species. They're maybe more tolerant of higher elevations or more shrubby and woody vegetation. That's characteristic of an altered marsh versus a natural marsh, which has lots of emergent plants that are like marsh obligate species. So I think this is a cool example of how the birds are serving as indicators of different qualities in that habitat. And potentially surveys like this can, again, set a baseline that in the future, as more things change in the habitat, we can look back on and compare. So to sum this up, the pros of the secretive marsh bird point count style surveys are that they're really non-invasive and hands-off. They give you lots of useful information. They can also be used as a rapid screening tool if you're looking for locations where rare species, the black rail, might be living. You can go all across the landscape and survey in a bunch of different areas, and if you hear black rails, that really then lets you kind of hone in and target certain areas for more in-depth research. Additionally, these kinds of surveys tell you a lot about the bird community composition, which then lets you infer certain things about the status or the quality or health of that marsh ecosystem overall. The cons, there aren't too many other than the fact that it does take a good amount of practice and training to get good at these surveys and ensure that you're being really consistent in your methodology and how you're detecting the birds and recording them accurately. I think the most challenging thing that has lots of differences between different observers is just estimating the distance to the bird. Finally, you are going out to these marshes like first thing in the morning. There are lots of bugs, lots of mosquitoes, and that can kind of make it hard to hear the birds. But these are really cool surveys, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else does their presentations on too.